Are you sick of scrolling through Netflix and Hulu searching for movies that are high quality and family friendly? Christian Cinema has thousands of movies available on demand that you can watch anytime, anywhere. When you sign up for a giving membership, a premium offering from Christian Cinema, you can watch 5 free movies every month. Learn more about becoming a giving member at givingcompany.com/giving membership and start watching great movies today. The other side of the road is safe, where we sidestep being bothered and avoid getting involved. But rolling up your sleeves and boldly going where few dare to tread, that's Walking Through Samaria. Each week on our podcast, we introduce you to the special few who walk in the spirit of the Good Samaritan. On behalf of the Giving Company and your hosts, David Hendrickson and Dan Riveros, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. I'm your host, Dan Riveros, with my co-host,
David Hendrickson.
How you doing, man?
Dan, we're back on Zoom. I thought we were getting out of this.
Back on Zoom. It's a new world, man. It's a new world, but I'm just glad to be here with you.
You've been vaccinated? Yeah, I mean, it's Friday before a long weekend. And
Have you been vaccinated?
Pardon me?
Have you been vaccinated?
I have, yes.
Okay, cool.
Because I want to travel, and I feel like if I'm going to be able to travel in this country or outside this country, it's going to be a requirement. And so
I think you're right. I imagine it'll most likely be like that.
Did you do it? You're a COVID survivor.
Yeah, so I got a whole strategy for when people ask me. So my first thing to do is say, I didn't do it with you, but if you ask me, my first thing to say is, did you? And if they say yes, and I go, I hear you, man, these guys are crazy out here. But my answer is the same regardless of how you respond. So that's my answer. I hear you.
You're a good Samaritan that way, right?
You know?
You can engage with everyone, vaccinated or unvaccinated.
Exactly. Who do we got today, David?
Dan, we have a return guest and a dear friend who is joining us today to talk about something really important. I was kind of hoping that we as a nation would have made a lot of progress since our first podcast with this individual, but unfortunately we have digressed. I think she would probably agree. Batya Ungar-Sargon, welcome back to the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
David, Dan, thank you so much for having me. I'm truly humbled to be able to speak to you and to speak to your listeners.
Oh, it is great to have you back. I do have to say I'm kind of sorry that we're back at it, right? Trying to talk about unity and objectivity and all these things. Again, I thought your previous podcast, we would have solved everything.
Not yet, sadly, not yet.
Not yet. Well, Batya, we are going to dive into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for our listeners. Batya lived in Israel, went to high school in Israel. She has been really active within the media circles over the last few weeks because of really all the things that are happening over in Israel, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, et cetera. We're going to dive into that. Batya, if you don't mind, I'm going to remind our listeners a little bit about you. There was a big change from the first time we had you on. And then we're gonna dive into this. We're gonna ease into this, have a little bit of fun, but then really try to hear from you on how we break down and approach and engage on what is another really difficult topic. So bear with me. Here is Batya Ungar-Sargon. For all of our listeners, she is the deputy opinion editor at Newsweek. That's right, Newsweek. Prior to this position, she was the opinion editor of The Forward, which is the largest Jewish media company in America. She came to The Forward from VinePair, where she was the managing editor. Prior to that, she worked for Tablet Magazine. She's written articles for the Times of Israel, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, the New York Review. She's obviously been a contributor to the opinion area of Newsweek and many others. She was recently announced as a member of the Civil Society Fellowship Class of 2021. This is a partnership between the Anti-Defamation League and the Aspen Institute. This fellowship, which is part of the Aspen Global Leadership Network, aims to prepare and engage the next generation of community and civic leaders, activists, and problem solvers from across the political spectrum. She has a Ph.D. from Berkeley after high school in Israel and college in the United States. Was that University of Chicago, Batya? Where was that?
Yes, sir. Yes, it was.
That's what I thought. And That was all in the U.S. Batya, again, we are thrilled to have you back on the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Welcome.
You just made me sound like exactly the kind of overeducated elite that I'm always railing against. So thanks for that.
I love you because you do rail against them. And I think if you're going to rail against them, you might as well have the kind of background that you have. We have to ask you, Batya, this is going off script. Sorry, Dan. Are you a sports fan at all?
So sadly, I do not understand sports ball at all. I can't really tell them apart, the teams or the different sports.
Okay.
So I'm sadly going to have to say no to that, David.
Well, the current villain in professional football is Aaron Rodgers, and he went to Cal. Anyway, that's all.
What makes him a villain?
He is making $33.5 million a year, and evidently that's not enough. He wants to quit his team.
Oh,
poor guy.
It's a lot more involved than that. And forgive me for you Packer fans out there. I'm a Packer fan as well, but he's kind of the current, like, really in professional sports.
Got it.
Wow. Poor guy.
No offense to Cal Berkeley. All right, Batya, first of all, Dan and I want to say congratulations on your promotion. You got a new gig. You are such a bigwig. Tell us about life at Newsweek, because the first time we had you on, you were at the Forward.
It's true. So I'm at Newsweek now. We actually recently launched a podcast as well called The Debate. It's hosted by myself and my boss, who's a big Trump guy, very conservative guy. And
at Newsweek?
At Newsweek.
No.
And each week I bring a liberal and he brings a conservative, and the four of us debate a contentious topic. It's a lot of fun. And I would say that that's sort of the major changes. Newsweek is really leaning all in on debates and civil discourse and hosting the broadest spectrum of legitimate views. And so it's been really wonderful being there. I personally, I'm trying very hard to foreground working class voices, because I feel that the working class has really been kind of deplatformed from the American media. And it's something I can really do at Newsweek. They're very supportive of that. And they are super, super invested in sort of anti-cancel culture and hosting the big debate. So it's really been wonderful.
It sounds like a great spot for you. Was it hard to say goodbye to the Forward and transition?
You know, I'll tell you, it's very funny because like in weeks like the past 3 weeks, I've been getting so many excellent pitches that would have been sort of perfect for the Forward about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and anti-Semitism and so forth. But I have to really be cognizant of our readership. You know, they don't want to read about this 4 times a day, you know, like this. So keeping these important issues afloat, but understanding who our readership is and really trying to cultivate that same trust from the readers has been really interesting and really fun.
That's great.
Awesome.
Well, it sounds like a great place for you. Despite University of Chicago and Cal Berkeley Ph.D., I mean, you are one of the freshest voices in journalism. I've said that a million times since our first podcast. And it has been so fun to engage in some of these topics for our listeners. The first topic that we unpacked a little bit with Batya was kind of the racial issues and some of the political discord. I would say we talked about Batya on the first podcast. You have to remind us again, how does somebody who is University of Chicago educated, PhD from Berkeley, you let us know that people of the Jewish faith, by and large, kind of lean left historically. How does somebody like you get to what I call the island of misfit toys, which is objective journalism, looking at both sides of every issue, trying to educate people, trying to create unity? How does that happen? Because we see very few examples of that in our society today.
I think it's 2 things. The first is I absolutely hate a bully. I cannot stand when bullies get away with things. And I think a major problem the left has is that it sees itself as permanently on the outside, and it doesn't recognize how much power it has, and it thus engages in a lot of bullying. And I find that disgusting. It's nauseating to me. And the second thing I would say is I'm a real populist. I believe in the wisdom of the people. I believe that as a religious person, I believe that the least among us often have the most to teach us. I think that's like a very religious precept,
Yes.
definitely very much in Judaism. So my Judaism tells me that. And then I look around and I see an American discourse, American politics that's being totally dictated by the like hyper-educated elites who look down their noses at those who have less. And those who have less are an increasingly bigger and bigger and bigger cross-section of America because of our broken economic system. So I think that has led me to often be like, to see how the working class sees things and see how the elites see things. Religion's a really great example. And to see their contempt for things that are clearly important and wise and good for society, and to see how the loss of those things has really corrupted the souls of many at the top. So I think that I would say those are kind of the two ways that I think, the two reasons that I feel that I'm able to critique the class that I belong to.
Yeah. That's really good. I'm gonna sidestep for a second. We had Rich Stearns on this podcast, Batya. I don't know if you recognize the name, but he was the CEO of World Vision USA for 21 years, I think. And he recently wrote a book, Lead Like It Matters to God. And he talked about this very same populist kind of reality. And he took it from a science perspective. If you remember you and I chatting about science on the first podcast, and here was the example that he gave. I'm going to go through this really quickly, but there was an experiment done about, I think it was about guessing the weight of a cow. And they had the experts, right? The agricultural PhDs and the farming experts, and they had a couple of them, and they guessed the weight of a cow. And then they had thousands of people who didn't know anything about anything with respect to farming, agriculture, animals, etc. And they took the average of all of the submissions from the masses.
Oh, wow.
And guess who was closer?
Was it the masses?
It was the masses.
That's amazing.
Wow. And so it was a really cool story about how sometimes I think we do get really oriented around the experts and the elites, as you say, in our society today. The masses have something to say, right? The masses have credibility. The masses have good wishes and good answers. And I thought that was a cool analogy.
Yeah, I mean, that story is fantastic and definitely fits with what I think. I mean, of course, one has to be careful, right? Like if the masses start saying we don't want to get vaccinated,
right?
There is a little bit of that, like where you kind of you want experts to have credibility, but I think that the problem with America right now is that the experts have lost their credibility by becoming partisan, and that's not on the masses. Like people who are suspicious of the CDC at this point and don't want to get vaccinated, like I don't blame them. I blame the culture that led to that suspiciousness.
Yeah, it's good.
That's right.
Well, we have a ton to talk about on a very specific topic, Batya, but before we go there, we had a lot of fun the first time talking about how much common ground just you and I have, for example, or you and Dan have, for example, just by creating relationships and creating conversation and being willing to dialogue. So before we get into a really tough topic, let's wade in there. You were the managing editor at VinePair. So I'm hoping you and I have maybe a love for wine as common ground.
I do love wine, but it's so embarrassing. It's like reminding me that I have a Ph.D. It's so pretentious, David.
Sorry. Well, just give me like one of your go-to porch pounders. And I'll do the same.
Porch pounders. I like that term.
Yeah. What's like a great wine that you love?
Okay, so this is so pretentious, but I'm very partial to Italian wines. And I will say this, before the pandemic, I really only drank red wine. I really didn't like white wine, and I had no taste for sparkling wine. But since the pandemic started, I've been drinking sparkling wine all the time. I'm just super into champagne right now. And like any occasion is like a good enough occasion. 6:30 p.m., done with my work. Let's, bust out the bubbly.
That's right. That's right.
What about you? What wine do you like?
Well, that is awesome. So I do like all kinds. I am partial to red, but I am a snob for Napa Valley. So anyway, I get a few shipments every year, maybe a few more than that, from a few wine clubs that I'm a part of, and really enjoy it. I love going out to Northern California. I love the country. I love the people.
I really need to level up is what I'm learning from this conversation. I'm like,
don't do it, Dan. Don't succumb to the peer pressure.
I know, we're total snobs.
This
Dan.
level of class that I'm being exposed to right now is just, wow, like, gonna definitely throw away all the Coronas I have in the fridge.
A really good Ultra Brut Batya for champagne I would love. I really like the dry ones.
Yeah, exactly.
I like this conversation better than like the IPA beer conversation. I don't fit in that one either. Everybody has like a favorite IPA. I'm like, yeah, man, I don't know.
Oh my God, totally. They're so much worse than the wine snobs. Beer snobs are like their own total, like, complete universe.
That's exactly right. You see how easy it is to create common ground? Like, Batya and I are wine snobs. So, who would have known? All right. With that as sort of our safety net, Batya, we are going to wander into something that I am sure has occupied your emotion and your probably for a long, long time. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, the last 3 weeks has probably occupied 100% of your time, your emotion, your brain power, etc. We want to unpack the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm a historian. I was a history major in college. How far back do we need to go to start to understand objectively this conflict?
All right. So it's a great question. And I'm going to answer your question with a question, which is, it's not only how far back do we have to go, it's how much does the history matter at all? And I'll give you an example. Like what, let's say the Bible commanded me to do something that I considered to be immoral, like even as a religious person. The Bible also tells us we have to use our own morals, right? It's in that story between Abraham and God, when God wants to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham says to him, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat." Does the one who judges the whole world will he not do justice, right?
Right.
What that story to me is telling me is that in a conversation between God and Abraham, God likes that he did that, right? God's like, you're right. And he likes that Abraham responded to him and said, you're telling me you're going to do something, but you have implanted within me a moral sensibility that tells me that I can say to you, God, that's wrong what you're going to do, right? What it means is that there is a moral sensibility that is beyond the Torah, beyond the Bible, but beyond God himself, right? That we, if we reach that level, are encouraged to push back and say, no, you, God, you implanted in me a sense of justice. And I am so confident in myself, in that justice that you put in my heart, that I can even say to you, God, that's wrong, right? So what I mean by that is, we have the Bible. The Bible says that God gave, Israel to the Jewish people. But to me, that's not relevant to today's context. Like, that's going too far back, because that's part of my spiritual narrative, my spiritual religion. But that I cannot expect somebody who's not a part of my spiritual journey to accept that, right? As an objective standard, as some sort of political standard
That's
for
right.
what should exist in the Middle East. That's what I would say about the history. So we can always go back and find, more and more grievances from both sides. But to a certain extent, to me, when I look at the problem there, I try to see it through a political lens, through a moral lens, through a lens of justice. And of course, then it's very obvious what needs to happen, which is that every single person living in that territory should have full civil rights and should have access to safety and security and dignity. So of course, how that happens, how we get there, we can debate about that. But so that I'm sorry to answer your question with a question, but I would say the history is very important. The history exists. Like, you can't talk about this conflict without talking about the Holocaust. You can't talk about this conflict without talking about, the way Jews were subjected to discrimination, persecution, and genocide for 2,000 years. You also can't talk about it without talking about the fact that 750,000 Palestinians who lived in that territory before 1948 no longer lived there after 1948. A lot of them fled. A lot of them were forcefully evicted. There are questions of how to deal with that from a just point of view. And then, of course, between 1948 and today, there have been always the back and forth, the question of, who's at fault, who was offered, the Palestinians were on numerous occasions offered, versions of a state that they turned down. They have some agency, they have some responsibility. Israel has more power, more agency, maybe more responsibility if you're on the left like me. So it's very complex. And I think that the most important thing is that we don't allow ourselves to turn off our humanity, our compassion, and our sense of justice, and allow us to create abstractions out of either the Jewish Israeli side or the Palestinian side, but that we continue to bring every faculty at our disposal that God implanted in our hearts when we look at both sides of this conflict.
Yeah, it's so good, Batya. And I just want to remind our listeners, Batya is of the Jewish faith. Obviously, we went all the way back to Abraham in this conversation. But in your op-ed on Newsweek, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, I want everybody who's listening to lean in, because Batya said, in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, real and urgent civil rights abuses have occurred against the Palestinians. So, like always, Batya, you are coming at this from an objective, nonpartisan, biased kind of way. We're trying to take, probably one of the challenges with this particular issue is how complex it is. Mm-hmm. And how many things matter. Like you mentioned, the Holocaust, 2,000 years of genocide and bias and those types of things against the Jewish people, the reality of 750,000 Palestinians displaced. All these things are part of the narrative, and to lose any of those data points for the purposes of bullying, like you said, political power, political bias, we never get to where we're supposed to get to from a justice standpoint.
I really appreciate you saying that. I'm a historian. So, and Dan, I know you and I have chatted about this. Mm-hmm. Can we maybe start at World War I, Batya, and I'm going to walk us forward, and you can correct all the things that I get wrong. I'm sure that you know it better than I do.
Well, so it seems to me that part of the world came under British colonial rule after World War I with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. That's sort of where I feel like things get real. And not that they weren't real before that, but like maybe tangible is a better way of saying it. In kind of 1947, well, let me mention what I believe happened from after World War I to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. The population in that area was a combination of Jewish people and Arabs. And in the time from the fall of the Ottoman Empire, British colonial rule to 1947, 1948, more and more Jewish people started to migrate to that area because of persecution in other parts of the world. That is true, correct?
Yes, that's my understanding as well, yes.
Yeah. And so while it's not, like you said, I remember having this conversation with Lee Jenkins on the racial topic. Like, with population comes power. And the reality is more and more Jewish people were fleeing other parts of the world, largely Europe, I think, at the time. And so the population of the Jewish people in that area was growing. There's a UN declaration in 1947. In 1948, British colonial rule ends. The state of Israel is established. And I'm a little blurry on the specifics, but that is the time when Palestinians were displaced from what was known as the state of Israel, and Jewish people were displaced from other Arab countries. Let me pause there and see if I'm still on track.
That's exactly right. Sorry. So, what happened so in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, it became clear that millions and millions and millions of Jews had been murdered and genocided. And so even more started, more tried to flee to Palestine during the war, before the war. They were not allowed because there were quotas put up because the British were worried about the Arabs rioting. And so after World War II, it became sort of clear that, this huge devastation, this huge horrible thing had happened. The UN then, for the last time in its history, voted, in favor of creating two states, really, creating a Jewish state and an Arab state in the area of what was then Palestine, right? Dividing the land between the Jews and the Arabs.
Yeah.
They didn't identify as Palestinians back then. You have to understand. They do now, and that's important. And we should call them how they identify today. But back then, this area was really kind of a backwater of Jordan, essentially.
Yeah.
And so the Arabs and both the Arabs living there and in all of the neighboring Arab countries, they said, no, we don't want to share this land with the Jews. We don't want half the land. Like, this is our land. Like, why should we split it? And I'm saying that in a neutral way because I can understand why they said that. I wish they hadn't, but I can understand that. I don't think that that's necessarily like something you couldn't understand, right? So the Arabs then, all the Arab nations then waged war on the Jewish population. They began a war. They started to attack in the wake of the UN declaration and their understanding that there was going to be a Jewish state there.
Yeah.
And somehow the Jews won that war. You have to understand, they didn't expect to. They thought there was about to be a second Holocaust. They saw the tanks coming from all of these, huge, very powerful Arab countries. And they really did not think that there was no way to understand that they were going to win, but they did somehow. And as a result, persecution against Jews living in these Arab countries that then lost that war became unbearable. I mean, they started treating Jews like a fifth column. There were show trials. There was a lot of torture of Jews, killings. And so those Jews then picked up, left everything, and fled to Israel. And it's so interesting because, the state of Israel really failed to save the Jews of Europe. But it did succeed in saving the lives of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Arab Jews living in Arab and Muslim countries who really were facing, indescribable persecution. Mm-hmm. And so then they all moved to Israel. Of course, the wars didn't stop, right? As you say, there were more wars following that. But that's your summary is spot on.
Well, thank you for the color and the additional detail. And I did forget to say, yeah, the declaration, the whole idea at the time was a two-state solution, and that's very important, I think, for the context of the discussion. Mm-hmm. I don't want to fast forward too fast, but we do need to get to kind of what's been going on the last 3 weeks. But my understanding of the history is that when the Arab nations attacked after the two nations were created, Israel kind of pushed the boundaries a little bit, right? So they did that in the interest of safety. So they said, well, we've been attacked. Maybe we need a little bit more land than we were originally designated from the UN declaration. And kind of the same thing happened after the Six-Day War in 1967. There's a buildup on the Israeli border. Israel actually attacks first, I think, in that case. they were reacting to a number of things: the pact between Syria and Egypt, the closing of the Strait of Tiran, all the buildup on their border. And in that war, which they won also in 6 days, they grabbed a little bit more land, again, for safety reasons. It seems to me that maybe the borders have changed a little bit since that original UN declaration because of these conflicts. That's also correct, right?
Yeah, so my understanding is that, people don't realize this, but the state of Israel, as it was declared in 1948, it did not include Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem was in the West Bank on that border, and so it was part of Jordan, actually. Israel did not win that in that war.
Yeah.
And what happened was in the 1967 war, it's funny because when you hear the soldiers who did this talk about it, they don't really even understand why they did it. What happened was they started to win. Again, like the feeling in 1967 on the eve of this war was that there's going to be another Holocaust. We're going to be wiped out.
Mm.
You know, Israel was so tiny, and there were so many of these countries, coalescing to attack them. And when they started to win, and when they captured this big hill right next to Jerusalem, and they realized that the Jordanian soldiers had fled. A soldier called his commander and said, "What do I do? Like, they fled. Like, do we keep going?" And one commander just said, "Keep going, keep going."
Yeah.
And so they kept going, and not by any design. They ended up retaking the West Bank and retaking Jerusalem. And the scenes of these soldiers arriving at the Western Wall, which is, the holiest place in Jerusalem for the first time in all of these years. And it's on the one hand, it's very moving to me, but on the other hand, it started a big problem because they took over the West Bank, which is a big area, and Gaza as well. But they did not make the Palestinians who live there citizens. Now, the Palestinians who lived there did not want to be citizens of Israel. It's very important to understand this. Actually, a lot of East Jerusalem Palestinians have been offered Israeli citizenship and turned it down. They want their own state. They want to be, citizens of a Palestinian state. And so they ended up living under military occupation for all of this time, where there was supposed to be some sort of Palestinian state created in that area, but the attempts to do so have failed. And in the meantime, Israel continues to occupy the West Bank and has this punishing blockade on Gaza. Right. So you have this situation where let's take the West Bank. You have Palestinians who are living under Israeli military rule, but they don't have the right to vote in Israeli elections. So they don't have the right to vote for the government that exercises state power against them. Mm. That's a civil rights abuse. That is a real problem. Now, it's not 100% Israel's fault, right? There have been offers of states. There has been massive amounts of terrorism that has made the Israeli population very hawkish and very unwilling to even countenance any kind of exchange with these people because of all the terrorism that they have had to suffer through. But Israel is imposing an unjust military occupation against people that it will not give the right to vote. Not that they necessarily want it. So that's a real problem. That is a real civil rights abuse. There are also, and I'll segue into this current conflict from this if it's useful.
And Batya, before we go there, I just want to clarify, if you are an Arab living in Israel, you do have the right to vote, correct?
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah, 20% of Israelis are Arabs, and they have, I would say, 95% of the same rights as Jews. You're never going to have the same 100% because there are problems with, they face discrimination in building, for example, in expanding their towns. Look, America under a similar situation has treated people who it considered a fifth column much, much worse than Israel does. Israel is very proud of its Arab minority and sees them as very integral to the fabric of society. At the same time, they do not have national rights, right? They don't get to say, I am Palestinian and I live in a Palestinian state. They live in a Jewish state. And so there is a little bit of tension there as well. But there are members of Knesset, members of parliament who are Arabs, and they do have full rights. I would say up to 95% the same as the Jews. But again, there's this attempt on the left to cast this in racial terms, and it's really false. This is not a racial conflict. It's a national conflict, right? It's not like the Palestinians are not like Black people in America, It's not like they are a minority a racial minority, right? The majority of Jews are Arabs as well, right? They have the same race as the Palestinians. The thing that makes them different is a national identity, right? And why am I insisting on this? Because when a government persecutes a person based on their race, that's just pure evil. You know, that person has no one else to come and protect them or defend them, no one to represent them.
Yeah.
Like, just total evil, right? That's white supremacy, and it is complete evil. There's no justification for it. That person had the person of color, let's say the Black person in America, being persecuted by the state in Jim Crow, for example, like, they have no recourse. They're a pure victim of pure evil. When you have two nations fighting, let's say, over a border, like the way Jordan and Israel were, and now the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Palestinians in the Gaza are with the Israelis, those people are armed, right? They have their own sense of who they are. They are looking to be their own nation, their own sovereign state, okay? So even though, yes, Israel is depriving Palestinians in the West Bank of citizenship, the way we got here was through two nations, both of whom exercise significant amounts of power and significant amounts of agency to get here, and both of whom have blame in how we got here. But also, this is sort of an in-between stage, right? This military occupation will at some point, God willing, end, right? It's not a form of discrimination. Now, again, like I said, you know, Arabs who live in Israel, they do face discrimination, and that is problematic, and we should fight against that. They face more police brutality, just like Black people face more police brutality, right? Those are real problems that we have to fix.
Right.
The problem is that the discourse in casting, first of all, in not differentiating between Palestinians who live in Israel and Palestinians who live in the West Bank, it erases the core of the problem, right? Because the problem is not, it's each of the Palestinian citizen segments has their own problem, right? In the West Bank, they don't have civil rights, right? In Gaza, it's that they're under blockade and ruled by a terrorist organization. Within Israel, it's that 5% that they still experience discrimination. Yeah. Each of these problems is a different problem that has a different solution, right? The problem in Gaza and
a good point. It's a good point. Yeah, there's almost three separate scenarios.
It's three separate scenarios, but I'll just end with this. What's the problem with saying it's just one problem? When you say that it's just one problem, the only solution to that problem is Israel not existing. Okay, right? That's the problem with it, is that the discourse on the left around the world has erased the differences between these three problems, such that the only solution that they would accept is getting rid of Israel, right? That's the problem with the way they talk about it. Okay, I'm sorry, I went on for so long.
Yeah, no. Perfect. And I think this context, and maybe it's just because the way my historical brain works, but the history matters. And I do believe that society today, for some reason, with all of the technology tools that are at our disposal, all the ways that we can access and research and get information, all the ways we can dialogue with people, we've gotten more narrow in our thinking. And it just boggles my mind how in today's day and age, with the access to information, the technology tools that we have, how our thinking has gotten more narrow. I'll never understand it.
I have a theory about why, if you want to hear it.
Bring it on. Yeah.
I think it's because, like, to me, when I see something inexplicable happening, like, you have to work really hard to use America's racial binary, which, again, is a bad enough way of understanding America, to try to understand the Middle East. Why is that happening? Why is everyone so willing and anxious to make this mistake that's, like, very, like, taxing on the mind? I think you have to ask, who is getting power out of this? Who is benefiting from this? I mean, I think that the narrowing you're talking about, you know, when something crazy like that happens, there's so much information available, and yet only one narrative emerges, and it's the totally wrong one. I always ask myself, like, someone's benefiting from this, you know, like, and that's why I really feel soured on the Democrats, because you really see them, like, they don't want to criticize anyone on their own side. Of course, the Republicans do the same thing, but they don't want to criticize anyone on their own side because it would reduce their power. But what that means is that you've abandoned any kind of moral high ground or any claim to a moral high ground if all you're pursuing is more power.
Right. Yeah, that's so well said. Well, can you fast forward us? I know it sure seems like the Palestinian issue in Israel, in the West Bank, in Gaza, all problematic, as you have mentioned, for different reasons and for decades, right? So there's a lot of history here. There's a lot of time. I can sort of see how this is going to boil over at certain points in time. And it has obviously boiled over in the last 3 to 4 weeks. Take us through the recent history, if you don't mind.
Will do. Okay, so the most recent thing that I think is relevant is that Israel does not have a government, and the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank don't have a government. So what do I mean by that? Israel has gone to elections. I think it's 4 times in the last 2 years. And every time, because it's a parliamentary system, they failed to establish a government. Okay, so it's unlike in America where there's only really 2 parties. In Israel, anyone can form a party. So there's like 3 big parties and then lots of little parties. And the way you become prime minister in Israel is if your party gets the most votes and you manage to create a coalition, which means you manage to get a majority of the other parties to say, I will sit with you. Yeah. Okay, that's how you become prime minister. It's very different. They don't vote directly for their prime minister. But what happened was Bibi Netanyahu, the current leader who's been in power for 12 years, is facing a lot of corruption charges. He's a deeply compromised person. And each time he gets just enough votes that his party has the most seats, but he can't get enough people to sit with him in the government. And if you can't get enough people to sit with you in the government, you go back to elections. This has happened multiple times. At the same time, the Fatah party, which is the ruling party in the West Bank, they have not had elections in a decade. And Hamas, which is a terrorist organization that has a political arm, has not had, they rule in Gaza, and they have not had elections since 2007. So basically, the Palestinians have not chosen their sort of local authority governments, and the Israelis don't have a government. So you have this sort of crisis of authority in both populations. This is a really important piece of the puzzle because the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank had promised that there was going to be elections, and Hamas got really excited because they thought, oh, we will be able to win, some support in the West Bank, not just in Gaza. And then the Palestinian Authority canceled those. So the first piece of context you need is Hamas was looking for an excuse to start up a provocation to show that they are the real defenders of the Palestinians. That's the first piece.
Got it.
The second piece is that because Israel doesn't have a government and there is no leadership, a lot of things that are bad under the best of circumstances are getting worse. For example, police brutality in East Jerusalem. It's a real problem and it's been getting a lot worse. And so Israel inexplicably decided to shut down the Damascus Gate, which is a place where during Ramadan, Palestinians like to gather and break their fast and celebrate and party and have events. And for some reason, Israel said, you can't sit here. Like they just took this area that was very important to a very volatile, angry population and said, you can't sit here. It was like a huge mistake. And I have not seen any explanation for why they did that. I don't think it was like some sort of like deeply thought out. It was just a mistake due to a lack of leadership and a lack of authority. So somebody made the decision. And so there was a lot of protest against that and a lot of police brutality, which ended up with the police actually entering the holy Al-Aqsa Mosque and throwing in stink bombs in this holy site, which is just unbelievably like stupid. It's horrible and it's really, really, really terrible. So that was the second thing that happened. And the third thing that happened was there's a neighborhood in East Jerusalem where a bunch of buildings are sitting on property that Jews purchased in the 1870s from the Ottomans. And they have documentation to show it. And when Jordan took over that area in 1948, they settled some Palestinian refugees in houses on this. They built the houses, settled them there, and they said to them, we will transfer over the property ownership to you. And they never did it. For some reason, Jordan just never got around to it. And in 1967, when Israel retook that area, they said that, the ownership rights went back to the Jewish trusts that had initially bought this land. So this case has been in court in Israel going back and forth between who owns it, the Palestinians or the Jews. Now the Jewish trusts, they want to evict the Palestinians and put Jewish people there. And the Palestinians said, these are our homes. We live here. Jordan promised us that we own these homes. So it's really a real estate dispute. The Israeli courts did rule that as long as the Palestinians paid rent, they had tenants' rights. They could not be evicted. But the Palestinians said, "Why should I pay rent on my own home?" And they see this as really part of a larger attempt to move more and more Jewish families into East Jerusalem, which is what the Palestinians eventually hoped would be the capital of their state. Now, the thing you have to understand about East Jerusalem is if you go there, it's all Palestinians live there. Very few Jewish families live there or Jews live there at all. It is perfect for, the capital of a Palestinian state. Right. So again, in another act of stupidity, the state of Israel has been putting its weight behind allowing Jews to really move further and further into this area, the way it's been putting its weight behind allowing them to build more and more settlements, which makes the prospect of a Palestinian state harder and harder for Palestinians to imagine. So those are the three things that were happening. This kind of fight over these buildings that is representative of a larger attempt to get Palestinians out of their home the way they see it, the police brutality at Al-Aqsa, and then Hamas really, agitating for an excuse to start lobbing rockets. And Hamas saw this opportunity and said, oh, we're going to step in and cast ourselves as the true defenders of the Palestinians and started throwing rockets into Israel. And then Israel started retaliating. That's kind of the backstory of the current flare-up.
Wow. And so I want to talk about how you've seen the U.S. react, but the rockets start flying, as you've mentioned. And I think one of the things that I read in your op-ed on Newsweek was, lots of clashes break out, right? Like in neighborhoods and just in normal society, the Palestinians and Jewish people, like they get into arguments, they get into fights, like there's bullying, to kind of use your term from previously. There's these little skirmishes. And then the rockets fly. In the case of 1948, in the case of 1967, in the case of, I'm sure, many times since then, when Israel retaliates, Israel shows power and shows strength, right? So isn't that kind of part of what's been going on in the past few weeks until the ceasefire?
Can I tell you something I think you might find interesting? This is a topic that I have changed my mind on very radically since 2014. It's funny because it's like I've really seen, like in 2014, I would have said to you, Israel has the Iron Dome. It stopped 90% of Hamas's rockets. So right. The idea that it needs to retaliate with its own airstrikes, to me, I felt that was immoral. Like Gaza is so cramped. It's one of the most tightly populated areas in the world. There are 2 million people living there in this tiny little strip. Wow. So there really aren't any areas that are free of civilians, and Hamas is a terrorist organization. So it's hidden within right. schools and hospitals. And so I in 2014, I felt very much like, you have the Iron Dome to protect you. Like you don't have a right to go on the offensive. And now I think that argument that I was so convinced of is like really like morally, like tragically immoral. Like they attack you. You have to be able to say, first of all, to your own population, like we're going to minimize their ability to do this again. Like the idea that Israel should not have the right to do that, I think is so tragically immoral. Like no one else would accept that standard for themselves, that they should absorb attacks that kill their citizens quiescently just because the people attacking them have worse technology. And it's just so funny, like looking back at how I was so convinced of this thing that I now feel is so deeply, deeply amoral. But you see this a lot on the left as well in the discourse, like because Israel is more powerful, therefore it must suffer having its citizens attacked quiescently without making a fuss, And so I think to your question, I don't know that it's so much about showing force. They claim that they killed 225 Hamas militants. So they are really trying to target the people who are targeting them. And they also claim that they managed to really destroy a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the tunnels that Hamas had built to make it easier for them to attack Israel. So, this whole question of like offense versus defense, I think it's just a little bit more complicated.
Totally agree. And I really appreciate the color. So it's been a tough time in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. We have what I would assume, or what I would describe as maybe a fragile ceasefire right now. Let's transition to the United States. And if you don't mind, Batya, I'm going to read directly from your op-ed in Newsweek. I want to congratulate you for getting, similar reaction to your op-ed as I got to mine on Newsweek. So I'd like...
Which was what?
Like, I don't know, insults.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, just, lots of anti what I was trying to say comments. My friend Marian Edmonds Allen from the Presbyterian Equality Group, she said, David, you're never supposed to read the comments. Like that's a rule. Anyway, I want to.
That's why I asked you, because I hadn't read them, and I was like, oh, I wonder if maybe they were nice.
Good. Never mind. Don't read them. They're perfect. They're perfect. So I want to read what you wrote, because I just want to continue to reinforce how objective you are. And we've obviously heard that from you in the last 15 or 20 minutes, but I want to read what you wrote, and then I want you to talk about what's going on in the U.S.
Okay.
So here's what you write at the very end of your op-ed about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Palestinian suffering is real. Too many have been killed in Gaza. Too many have been brutalized by the police. For too long, Palestinians living under military occupation in the West Bank have been deprived of basic civil rights, like the right to vote for the government that exercises state power against them and freedom of movement. For too long, Gaza has been forgotten and left to languish under an unnecessarily brutal blockade, its young people and children deprived of any future. Israel has all too often penalized nonviolent resistance instead of bolstering civil society and supporting a new generation of Palestinian leadership. These all fall squarely on Israel's shoulders, and all nonviolent means of pressuring Israel to solve these problems are legitimate. But as with racism in America, the discourse that has been proliferating on the far left for years, and which is now part of the American mainstream, I love what you write here, rebrands these problems in ways antithetical to solving them. Rebrands these problems in ways antithetical to solving them. I just think that's so powerful. Just as no one is going to abolish the police, Israel is not going to cease to exist just because a viral Instagram post says it doesn't exist, or because hundreds of thousands of Twitter accounts say it doesn't have a right to exist. Powerful words. Talk about what is going on in the U.S., and you've been pretty active on social media, like making your case here.
So thank you so much for reading that. So what I mean by rebrands these problems is, so in the case of the U.S., I think this is really clear. So there's this new anti-racism, quote unquote, discourse. And again, just like how the civil rights, abuses against Palestinians are real, racism is a real problem. Every instance of racism in America deserves our attention. And we really, need to solve this problem once and for all. The problem is that the discourse, the anti-racist discourse on the left, also known as wokeness or critical race theory, it's not actually trying to solve racism, right? So we know, for example, from studies and from data that the police insult Black people more, manhandle them more, push them up against the wall more, punch them more, lay hands on them more.
Exactly. It's not even up for debate, right?
It's not even up for debate, right? It's data, right? They don't actually shoot Black people more. I don't know what kicks in when their finger's on the trigger. The data shows that there isn't actually a big difference there in murder and killing. But in manhandling, insulting, treating Black people like they are less than, like they are worthy of being insulted and manhandled and pushed around and beaten up, like it's a real problem, okay? But you don't have now people saying, actually you do on the right, people like Senator Tim Scott saying like, we need police reform, right? Like that would be like the thing that you would do if you really wanted to solve this problem. instead what you have is like this crazy cry to abolish the police or defund the police, which is like not even popular in minority communities. If you ask Black people how much time they want the police to spend in their neighborhoods, 81% say the same amount of time or more time, right? So instead of doing what would actually solve the problem, right, what Black people actually want, this discourse that's like led by these white affluent liberals has developed to create some maximalist, ridiculous problem, right? And what it does is it rebrand. The problem is not that there are police, right? The problem is that the police have a racism problem, right? So what they did was they rebranded the problem in a way that would make sure it would never get solved, because nobody is going to like actually abolish the police. And so you're seeing this now with this, George Floyd Policing Act that Senator Tim Scott wrote that he's negotiating with the Democrats over, and they're just going back and forth and they can't even like arrive at any kind of solution that we desperately need because they're all stuck in this like rebrand. And the same thing is happening, I think, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, you have these very vocal congresswomen talking about, Israel as committing genocide against Palestinians or as being an apartheid or as engaging in ethnic cleansing. And these are all rebrands of actual problems that exist in such a maximalist way. The only thing that would solve it for them, the only thing that would make them feel that there was redress to the Palestinians would be what Hamas wants, which is Israel not to exist. And that is never going to happen. Like over mine and every other Jew's dead body, right? Like, you're going to have to climb over a lot of, that will never happen because, thank God, the American people are extremely Zionist and extremely supportive of Israel and of Jews. And so, like, what they've done is they've rebranded the problem in a maximalist way that ensures that the actual problems that exist are no longer, on the table for, being solved. And even worse is like me saying this, right? This is an act of like, they would brand this as racist because I'm saying, no, like that's, the way that you're talking about this is problematic. And it's even gotten worse than that. So what we've seen in this last week is like, there have been a huge spike in violent anti-Semitic attacks. Like Jews are just being beaten up and attacked across the streets of America, like across the country, across Europe. And instead of like the leaders of the pro-Palestine movement standing up and being like, we unequivocally condemn this. This is not who we are. Like, stop this, cut it out. What you're starting to see now is people say, don't apologize for anti-Semitism. They're just trying to change the subject from Israel's crimes. Like, the narrative now developing is these sneaky Jews are inventing some fake narrative to distract from Jewish crimes, right? It's like the oldest anti-Semitic trope in the book. And it's just horrifying, like, to see this catching hold of people in America. This is very common in Europe where anti-Semitism has, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of history. But America has always been such a welcoming place to Jews. And a lot of us are starting to feel like, my God, is that changing? And it's really, really been, every Jewish person I know is just sitting here horrified at what we're seeing, at the way people are talking about not Israel, but about us, about it. So it's been a really, really tough few weeks.
Wow. Yeah, I don't know that I have seen before now a backlash against a message that's fighting anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Right? Like this is something different and concerning. And what I think we can also do, because I have many Christian friends who remind me of the same things you've reminded us of, which are the challenges that the Palestinians are facing. And there is a small percentage of Palestinians that are Christian, and they're experiencing many of the things that you have talked about. And so I just don't understand why we can't look at this holistically. And I just, do you have like a couple tips on because you've talked about the reasons why you think this narrow perspective on really important issues has occurred in our culture. You know, there's a bunch of evangelicals here listening to us talk. Do you have some suggestions on how we shake off this narrow-minded view of this issue and other issues, and how we really look for the right solutions, the sustainable solutions, the things that can be implemented, the things that can help, versus things that are, like you said, almost just reinforcing the current balance of power?
It's a really great question. It's the most important question, and I'm so glad you asked it. I don't have a good answer. I would say a couple of things.
We're in real trouble, Batya, if you don't have an answer.
Bust open the wine, guys.
I think so. One thing I would urge is, Israel's not perfect. It's committing, civil rights abuses. And I, as someone who cares deeply about the Palestinians, I think, people should be able to criticize Israel, freely. Our taxpayer money is going there. Like, that's fine. At the same time, if this is the one issue that somebody is attached to, and they've never thought twice about the genocide that China is actually perpetrating right now against the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, and they don't care at all about, the civil rights abuses or the human rights abuses, anywhere else. I would ask them to really ask themselves, like, why this issue? Like, Israel exists because you, non-Jewish people, treated us so poorly for so long. Like, we can imagine a world in which, like, Jews were treated well in their host countries and did not need this state. But it is so clear, even today,
right,
like, how important that state is. And obviously, I don't mean you two, but I mean, like, if somebody who's not Jewish and not Palestinian, like, I would just ask them, like, why is this the issue? Really do a soul searching. Like, why is this the one issue of all of the human rights abuses around the world that you care about? It's not illegitimate. Like, you could have a good reason for this being the issue. But I think, it's just a lot of it stems from people who feel uncomfortable with Jewish power or with Jews having the ability to stand up for themselves and not be at the mercy of, a host country that could turn on them at any moment. And to begrudge the Jews that, anyone who begrudges us that, the onus is really on them to prove to me that they don't have anti-Semitic feelings. So I would say, like, the first thing is soul searching. The second thing is, like, the most important thing on this planet, like, I really feel like I am in a war against dehumanization. And I am inviting people to join me in this war. Like, I am a soldier. I have a walk-on part in this war on dehumanization that, our politicians and social media are really waging against us. And I would just say, if you go into this conflict and this topic with that mindset, it's really, you're checking yourself. You're putting a check on yourself that every time you feel like, when you see a video on social media or something and you feel that, yeah, those terrible people, whatever side it is that you're, is the other side of you, I knew they would do that, like, whether or not you're saying that about the Israelis or the Palestinians, like, you just put a check on that. Like, your job is to see every person as a human being and to treat them with dignity and respect. And that is the most important thing, is to bring that mindset to every minute. And you can do this every minute you're on social media. You can wage a war against dehumanization, and you can insist on seeing people as humans and as the children of God,
Yes.
So I would say that's the only advice I would have. But I am just despairing and despondent like you. So
and nothing that you just said was insane or crazy. It always just comes back to the basics, right?
Yeah, those are two really good tips. I think there's two things that come to mind, Batya. One is, when did we decide that our fellow countrymen and women were our enemy?
Yeah.
Like, I'm kind of disappointed, I guess I must say, in our political parties and we could, well, maybe that's not even fair. We could blame it on politics. We could blame it on the media, no offense. But at the end of the day, it's us who are making these comments on social media, who are specifically promoting one side or the other. And I just woke up one morning going, when did we decide that the best way we were going to deal with one another was to make our fellow countrymen and women our enemy? Like and frankly, if we're believers, like you've talked about, thank you, our fellow man, our fellow people. The second thing is, and this is the circle of life that I would like for people to get their head around, and why I find your perspective so refreshing but so credible, is if you are a person of the Jewish faith and you understand the history, you know full well for thousands of years, like you've said, the terrible treatment of Jewish people that has occurred around the world. That frankly, like you mentioned, led to the establishment of a Jewish state. Wouldn't those very same people of the Jewish faith do everything that they can to support Palestinians, Muslims, atheists, Buddhists, whoever, who are also being treated poorly? Like, isn't that sort of the way it would work?
Well, so to me, it's sort of like, I don't think that it's funny because like,
that's what you're saying, right? You're saying, hey, there are real civil rights abuses that are being conducted against the Palestinians, and we should be concerned about that, knowing full well the plight of my Jewish people for several thousand years.
Well, I will push back a little bit against that framing because I don't
frame it for me. That's why we're here.
I don't think that having been subjected to discrimination creates like a higher moral burden. That you hear that a lot. Like you hear like
that's fair. Yeah,
right, it's not the Jewish burden to be better than everybody else. We just want to be treated the same as everybody else. We will still have, people who do bad things as well, of course. But we don't want I think it's just the idea that there should be a heavier burden, I think seems a little bit unfair to me.
I didn't mean to paint it like,
I know.
I almost meant it like a sensitivity, right? Like, if I understand what it's like as a people group to be persecuted, I would have a radar up for other people groups as well, not just my own. I guess that was sort of the point.
I think Jews in America very much feel that way.
Yeah.
I think Jews in Israel, once you've been through something like the Second Intifada, where 1,000 Israelis were killed in cafes, at weddings, in restaurants, that's the equivalent of 50,000 Americans, right? Imagine that there was, people living amongst us and 50,000 Americans were killed in 4 years in terrorist attacks. You would stop seeing these people as like a persecuted minority, and you would start seeing them as people who are, who think you don't have the right to live and to exist. And I'll just tell you, I am on the left, but I feel very humbled by, my grandfather who survived the Holocaust. He lived in England until he was 80 years old. And then he moved with my grandmother to Israel. And he said to me, Batya, until I got here, I never stopped looking over my shoulder.
Yeah.
And it's just like, I don't feel that I owe anybody anything that trumps that, given his experiences.
That makes total sense. Yeah.
So I guess that's what I would say.
No, it's good. That's good. Well, I really love where you have guided us, Batya, in this conversation of the soul searching, being against dehumanization. I just think this is going to lead us to a bit of a question. I think sometimes it's really hard for people to dive into a topic from both sides. We had Benjamin Watson on the show. Dan, gosh, that wasn't that long ago, right? 3 weeks?
No, 3 weeks ago.
Something like that.
Yep.
And he did a documentary, Batya, on abortion. And he very specifically went and spoke to pro-life people and to pro-choice people, right? Those were part of his documentary. That's sort of what you should do, I would think. I have seen one example in the last month of someone, and maybe Newsweek has done this, so forgive me if I've missed it. But I've seen one example in the last month where somebody had a well-known representative of the Jewish faith, that was Alan Dershowitz, and a well-known representative from the Palestinians, that was Shadi Hamid, on the same show at the same time to dialogue with one another, and it was Megyn Kelly's podcast.
So on the debate at Newsweek, which you can find on Apple Podcasts and anywhere you get your podcasts, we had a debate between a Palestinian and somebody who used to work at CUFI, Christians United for Israel, and they debated the issue, and it was really fabulous. So check that out. But you're totally right. It is all too rare. It is all too rare.
Yeah, and so that's kind of my question. Why are we so hesitant to embrace these conversations? And congratulations to Newsweek for doing the same thing that Megyn Kelly did, because the answers are in these conversations.
I'll tell you why, because if you change your mind, you lose all your friends. I mean, that happened to me. Like you get canceled if you have the wrong opinion. So it's extremely dangerous to change your mind or to be open. Like the last thing you want is to hear someone on the other side who makes a good point. It's literally dangerous.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you to Newsweek for doing that. I am going to go on Apple Podcasts and listen. I literally have done as much research, knowing we were going to have you back on, as I possibly could, and I've even ordered some books, that represent specifically one side or the other, and certain people in my life, to your point, are like, well, why did you order that book? Anyway. Yeah. So that's the deal. So speaking of books, you have a book out.
I do. Well, it's not out yet, but it's available for pre-order.
Okay, so you have a book almost out. Give us the scoop. That's my best journalism word, scoop, on your book that's coming out.
My book is called Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. And it's just about all of this stuff. It's about how these ideas that used to be sort of safely relegated to the hallways of academia, like cancel culture and anti-Zionism and open borders and intersectionality, how the media has mainstreamed these ideas and why they did it. And I argue that this obsession with race is a way of avoiding a much needed conversation about class, like that the true divide in America is about class. It's about economics. It's about whether or not you have a college degree. And it's very uncomfortable for elites to talk about that because it calls out their own privilege. And so liberal elites have fastened on this racial narrative as a way of not having that other conversation and distracting from it. That's kind of the argument of the book. I go through the history of populist journalism and how things could have been different, and the abandonment of the working class in the media. I talk about Trump, of course, and that's the book.
Well, that is awesome. So it's available for pre-order on Amazon right now?
Yes, sir. Yes, it is.
Hey, everybody go pre-order Bad News. Batya's new book. Batya, I gotta give you a confession, because this is another potential area of common ground. Because I am so pro education, and I'm pro higher education. My daughter's going to law school this fall. My son wants to get his Ph.D. in religion. Like, I'm a huge higher education fan. I got denied from the University of Chicago. So,
wow.
So I want you to know I applied for graduate school. I was living in Chicago, and I applied 3 places: DePaul, Northwestern, and University of Chicago for business school. And I was accepted by Northwestern and DePaul, and I was denied.
That's terrible.
So I went to Northwestern, but I got nothing but love For University of Chicago, because that's where I wanted to go.
Now, Dan, are you a big proponent of higher education, or do you think it's less important?
I think that there's places that will get you that you won't be able to get into without it. I mean, I think that's a reality, right? Now, do I think that you can pick up on skills and trades and learn the same things on your own and life will teach you lessons? Oh, 100%. I feel like there's no better teacher in this world than life.
Yeah.
But sure, I mean, hey, you know, that degree, a higher learning degree, that's going to get you some places that you're not going to be able to get in. You're not going to be able to sit at the table without it, you know?
Right.
So, and Dan, I think one parent is a doctor, one is a dentist, right? Like you've got got some hardcore education, and
I got a big family of psychologists. That's like That's
that's interesting. What was that like growing up?
I've got my father's a psychologist, my aunt's a psychologist, and my uncle is also a psychologist. Same with my cousin. I'm one of the only ones who didn't go into it.
Wait, so were you constantly being like psychoanalyzed by your dad?
I didn't feel that way. But I did work for his office when I was in college. So his practice was domestic violence offenders and violent sex offenders.
Oh my God!
Yeah. So
I should be interviewing you. That's so fascinating.
Yeah. So in college, I ran the receipts. So my job was to deal with probation officers, and I actually sat in the 12-week program because it was like group counseling with the domestic violence guys, you know.
Oh my God!
And honestly, like that changed my perspective on a lot of things. I was like, man, this is just stuff that should be in school. This is just emotional intelligence 101 here, you know.
Like what? Like what? Give us an example.
I mean, just, you know, like some of these guys weren't bad guys. They just didn't know how to manage their emotions. It was, you know, like anger, you know, they just reacted. There was no buffer. They're just going off first instinct feeling, you know.
Oh my God.
It's like things that, you know, if you know, you grew up in a household where, you know, you didn't see violence, you learned how to, you know, you learned how to deal with your emotions. Everyone feels, you know, everyone feels things, you know. No matter who you are, you feel things, you know, but it's how you react to them. So a lot of people aren't blessed with the basics at home. Now, when it came to the violent sex offender stuff, David will get a kick out of this because my job was actually to proofread his dissertations. And I'm not a proofreader. Like any email or chat with me is filled with just so many spelling and grammar issues. So that's funny that was my job. But I read a few of his dissertations on the violent sex offenders, and I couldn't do it. I read one and a half, and I was like, "No, I can't do this. I don't know how you even."
Because it was too dark.
It was the darkest thing ever. It was like you don't excuse the action that these guys have done. You know, like it's awful. But when you start looking at some of the backgrounds that these people come from, it's like, well, no wonder this. You know what I mean? This, lack of a better term, this monster was created. You know.
Oh my gosh!
We've done a fair amount of research, Batya, in the gang intervention realm.
Yeah.
And actually, as part of this podcast, we had Doreen Diaz on. Her brother was killed. Her older brother was killed by a gangbanger, and we dove into Father Greg Boyle and Homeboy Industries in California, and all the things that have been learned about why people choose gangs, and they're really looking to escape their home life or whatever it might be, and it causes you to have a bit of a different perspective on violent gang crime.
Totally.
Yeah. So Batya, we are going to wind down, but I want to ask you one more question, if you don't mind, before we let you go. Thank you for giving us a framework in which we could unpack the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think this has been really enlightening and really thoughtful and insightful. You issued a challenge to me and to Dan and to Giving Company and to evangelicals, 80 million strong in the U.S. last time we had you on our podcast, about how do we become the voice for the voiceless? Mm-hmm. How do we become the champions for the poor, for the victims of injustice, for, you know, why is it that evangelicals have lost their leadership, if they ever even had it, on being the voice of compassion and care in this country. My guess is you'd probably still give us a failing grade because we haven't solved everything in the last few months, unfortunately, from our first conversation. But can you maybe give us one more battle cry around evangelicals potentially taking the compassion lead in the U.S., if not all around the world?
Wow. Oh, God. I feel like that was so arrogant of me to say that.
Not at all. We're going to take it as our challenge.
It's funny because, like, I was watching Fox News the other day, and they had a segment on this conflict, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they had one liberal on, and she was saying, the classic, all the things I said are wrong on this podcast. And there were 4 hosts on it was one of their, like, little lunchtime roundtables. It was like Harris Faulkner and a bunch of other people. And they all just, like, they erupted in rage at her. Like, they were so, like, pro-Israel and, like, denouncing anti-Semitism. And, like, I was just sitting there and, like, I felt, like, bathed in this warm glow. But at the same time, I knew it was wrong, like, for me to bask in that, because there are problems in Israel and we do need to be vocal about them, and we do need to speak up against civil rights abuses. So I feel like I was very, like, morally compromised in that moment where I was like, oh, yeah, I just want to hear, like, what I want to hear. But the truth is, like, we really have to be, like you said, like, dispassionate and objective about it. So I would say, like, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, like, make sure that you're not demonizing Palestinians. You're not reducing the Palestinian people to Hamas. Even if the Palestinian people feel that Hamas represents them, like, in Gaza, if you write something on social media against Hamas, they come to your house and pull you out and they blow off your kneecaps, like, there's no real freedom there. So, I guess I would say, yeah, like, I think, being vocal in this sort of war against dehumanization and trying to make sure that your leaders don't allow themselves to be morally compromised in the pursuit of power.
Yeah.
You call out wrong when you see it, even on your own side. Like, I think that that's kind of the challenge of the moment, if I'm thinking about it. And I would say that that's really the call here, is to be vigorous and vigilant. Because, you can only influence your own side, you can't influence the other side. And so it's very important to be, morally vigilant about your own side and not let yourself get away with what I did when I was watching Fox, which is just, like, hearing the things that you want to hear and not remembering the things that you need to remember.
It's so good.
That's so great.
Good. Hey, Batya, remind our audience how they can find you on social media or wherever.
Yeah, my email is b.ungar-sargon@newsweek.com. I would love to hear from you anytime. You can find me on Twitter. It's @bungar-sargon. I really would love to hear from you. So please don't hesitate to reach out. You can, find our podcast, The Debate, at newsweek.com. And then, of course, pre-order my book if it sounds interesting to you. And Dan and David, I just can't thank you enough for this conversation. It means so much to me.
Batya, the pleasure is all ours. Thank you for returning and on such short notice to talk about this. And if I was quiet, it's just because I'm listening.
Yeah, I wanted to hear more what you thought about everything, Dan. Next time.
I don't know what to think of it. I'm just taking it in. I'm just taking it for what it is. It's something that's been here way before me, and I hate to say it. It feels like it's going to be here after me too.
Yeah, I feel that way too.
Yeah, Batya, thank you so much. As you were talking about all of us sort of being aware of our leaders taking positions of power and reinforcing their positions of power, and how we have to be aware of that and deal with that. It reminds me of the reason we named this podcast Walking Through Samaria is in the parable of the Good Samaritan. The priest and the Levite were in positions of power, and it was the Good Samaritan that walked across the road to serve and care for the Jewish person that had been robbed and beaten. And that's what we're supposed to be about. We're not supposed to align along power definitions and organizations of power. You can look at the church, frankly. and say, at times we've taken a posture of power, not of compassion, not of care, not of grace. So I just want to thank you so much for reminding us of that. And I want to thank you for bringing your unique perspective to this discussion on a really difficult topic. And I just want to encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. You're clearly at the place that God wants you at Newsweek to host these discussions about different positions on really difficult topics. And it's just amazing for me to see how God's using you in this time. And so I just want to continue to wish you well and encourage you to keep doing this great work.
That means so much to me, David. Thank you so much.
Well, that's it, everyone. It has been a delight talking to Batya Ungar-Sargon once again on the Walking Through Samaria podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. We will talk to you next time. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. For more content like this, visit us at givingcompany.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Walking Through Samaria.